The cool, sweet sensation melting on his tongue was unlike anything Sergeant Paolo Revelli had experienced in years. Standing in the sweltering Arizona heat on July 15, 1943, the 32-year-old Italian prisoner of war closed his eyes in disbelief. The desert temperature outside soared past 100 degrees, yet here he stood, consuming a bowl of vanilla ice cream, served casually by his American captors. His hands trembled slightly as he took another spoonful, the cognitive dissonance nearly overwhelming. What Paolo experienced in that moment defied 20 years of fascist propaganda about American barbarism and scarcity. The Americans weren't just winning the war. They were so abundantly supplied that they could afford to serve frozen desserts to enemy prisoners in the middle of a desert, thousands of miles from any production facility. As Paolo later wrote, in a letter smuggled home to his family in Naples, "These Americans serve us ice cream in the desert, not as a special treat, but regularly. In Italy, we cannot find bread, while our captors complain if the ice cream truck arrives late. I have been told lies about what America is." The journey that brought Paolo Revelli to this moment of revelation began far from the Arizona desert. As a decorated soldier in Mussolini's 10th Army, Paolo had fought across North Africa, believing wholeheartedly in the superiority of the Axis forces and the inevitable collapse of the materialistic, undisciplined American war machine. Fascist newspapers and propaganda films had portrayed Americans as soft, unprepared, and unable to sustain a prolonged conflict. Military instructors told Italian soldiers that America's industrial capacity was a myth, that its diverse population would fracture under pressure, and that its soldiers lacked the spiritual fortitude necessary for victory. Most importantly, Italian soldiers were assured that America's supply lines would be its downfall, stretched across oceans, vulnerable to U-boat attacks, and ultimately unsustainable. The reality Paolo encountered at Camp Florence in Arizona defied every aspect of this narrative. Paolo was one of approximately 50,000 Italian prisoners transported to the United States during World War II. These prisoners had surrendered, primarily in North Africa, where the Allied forces had decisively defeated the Italian and German armies by May 1943. The logistical feat alone was staggering. The Americans had not only defeated Axis forces thousands of miles from their homeland, but had then transported tens of thousands of prisoners across the Atlantic Ocean during an active global conflict, only to house them in camps with amenities that exceeded what many Americans themselves had during the Great Depression. The prisoner of war system established by the United States during World War II was unprecedented in its scale and humanitarian approach. By the end of the war, America would hold over 425,000 enemy prisoners on its soil, a number that would have been logistically impossible for most nations to manage. The Geneva Convention established standards for the treatment of prisoners, but the United States frequently exceeded these requirements, particularly for Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender and subsequent declaration of war against Germany in October 1943. What began as compliance with international law evolved into a powerful, if unintentional, demonstration of American industrial might and abundance. The journey from battlefield capture to American soil was itself a revelation for most Italian prisoners. After surrender, many expected harsh treatment based on their own military's approach to enemy captives and the propaganda they had consumed. Instead, they received medical attention, regular meals, and transportation on the same ships that had brought American soldiers to the front. Ships that returned to America with supplies rather than sailing empty. This efficient use of transport capacity was the first indication of America's logistical superiority. While German and Italian supply ships often returned empty after delivering men and materials to North Africa, American planners ensured that every voyage served multiple purposes. Even the handling of prisoners became an opportunity to demonstrate systematic efficiency. For men like Lieutenant Marco Belli, a 28-year-old tank commander captured near El Alamein in November 1942, the contrast was immediately apparent. On the transport ship, I received the same rations as the American Guards, he later recalled in a debriefing after Italy's surrender. I had been without proper food for weeks before my capture, as our supply lines had collapsed. Yet these Americans crossed an ocean and still had more food than we had a few hundred miles from our bases. The Americans' seemingly inexhaustible supply chain contradicted everything Italian soldiers had been told about the impossibility of sustaining war efforts across such distances. When the first Italian prisoners arrived at camps scattered across 46 states, they encountered conditions that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about their captors and, by extension, the likely outcome of the war. The typical POW camp in the United States featured barracks that were often better constructed than the temporary housing many Italian soldiers had occupied during the North African campaign. Camps included medical facilities, recreational areas, canteens, and, most shockingly to the prisoners, mess halls serving food in quantities that seemed wasteful by European wartime standards. Most camps were built according to standardized plans that could accommodate approximately 3,000 prisoners, though some held many more. The speed with which these facilities appeared across the American landscape was itself a testament to industrial capacity that few European observers had believed possible. For Paolo Rivelli and his fellow prisoners at Camp Florence, the revelations came in stages, each more disorienting than the last. The first shock was the sheer size of the American interior, endless stretches of developed land connected by paved roads and railway systems that functioned with remarkable efficiency despite the wartime demands on resources and manpower. Having fought in the confined battlefields of North Africa and grown up in the densely populated urban landscapes of southern Italy, the vastness of America was itself a kind of psychological weapon, suggesting resources beyond imagination. As the train carrying newly captured prisoners made its way from the East Coast debarkation points to Arizona, the men pressed against windows, watching as mile after mile of cultivated farmland passed by, with no signs of the scarcity that plagued their homeland. The second revelation came in the form of the camps themselves. Far from the primitive holding pens many had expected, the American POW camps were carefully planned communities with infrastructure that surpassed many Italian villages. Camp Florence, like most American POW facilities, had been constructed in months, yet featured concrete foundations, insulated walls, proper sanitation, and electrical lighting throughout. The Americans had built small cities in the desert, complete, with water purification systems, sewage treatment, and power generation. When Paolo arrived in April 1943, the camp was already housing over 3,000 prisoners, with construction underway to expand capacity by another 1,000, all, while America was fighting a two-front war against the most powerful military forces on the planet. But it was the food that delivered the most profound psychological impact. On his first day at Camp Florence, Paolo stood in line at the mess hall, expecting the meager rations he had grown accustomed to in the Italian army. Instead, he received a tray loaded with portions that would have fed his entire squad in North Africa: eggs, bacon, toast with butter, coffee with real sugar, and fresh fruit. Corporal Vittorio Mazzi, a fellow prisoner who had worked as a chef in Milan before the war, stood next to Paolo in line and whispered, "This cannot be sustained. It must be for show, to break our morale by showing what we cannot have." Yet the following day the portions were the same, and the day after, and every day that followed. Within the first week, most Italian prisoners had gained weight, a fact documented with almost clinical precision by the camp's medical staff, who conducted regular health assessments. The average Italian prisoner gained 7 pounds during their first month of captivity. By the third month, Most had gained over 15 pounds, and reports from medical officers noted significant improvements in overall health, dentition, and even height among younger prisoners whose growth had been stunted by wartime nutritional deficiencies. Captain Robert Doyle, the medical officer at Camp Florence, kept meticulous records that would later become part of a broader study on the physiological impacts of nutrition. In his notes from September 1943, he wrote, "The transformation in these men is remarkable. Many arrived with the sunken eyes and protruding ribs characteristic of prolonged malnutrition. Within 90 days they appear as different men, filling out uniforms that once hung from their frames, showing improved skin tone and demonstrating energy levels that contrast sharply with their condition upon arrival. This physical transformation paralleled a psychological one, as the prisoners began to recognize that what they were experiencing wasn't an elaborate deception, but rather the standard operating procedure for a nation with resources they had been unable to imagine." The revelation came in different forms for different men, but for Paolo Revelli, it was the ice cream that crystallized the truth of his situation. The desert camp, facing summer temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees, had refrigeration, sufficient not only for preserving food and cooling water, but for providing frozen desserts as part of the standard mess rotation. When Paolo first saw the ice cream being served on that July afternoon in 1943, he assumed it must be for the American Guards. When he realized it was included in the prisoner meal plan, he initially refused to believe it. "Gelato? In questo deserto?" he asked the mess hall server in disbelief. "Ice cream? In this desert?" The American server, a young private from Michigan named James Wilson, didn't understand the question beyond recognizing the word for ice cream. He simply nodded and added an extra scoop to Paolo's bowl, misinterpreting the Italian's shock as enthusiasm. This casual generosity, the unthinking addition of an extra portion simply because it was available, would become emblematic of what the Italian prisoners called l'abbondanza americana, the American abundance. For Paolo, the ice cream was more than a luxury. It was a logistical impossibility made manifest. In that moment, as the frozen dessert melted on his tongue, Paolo's understanding of the war fundamentally changed. If the Americans could deliver ice cream to prisoners in the Arizona desert in July, their industrial capacity was beyond anything Mussolini's propaganda had claimed. It meant their supply chains were not strained, but robust. It meant their technological advantages extended to even the most mundane aspects of life. Most importantly, it meant that Italy, and by extension, Germany, was not fighting a nation on equal footing, but rather a production colossus against which conventional military strategy was futile. As Paolo and his fellow prisoners adjusted to life at Camp Florence, the evidence of American abundance accumulated in ways both large and small. The camp's canteen, where prisoners could purchase additional items beyond their provided necessities, stocked products that had disappeared from Italian shelves years earlier: chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned fruits, writing paper, and even non-essential items like aftershave and hair pomade. Prisoners received an allowance for labor, performed within the camp or on nearby farms and orchards, and most found themselves with disposable income for the first time in their military careers. The work program itself became another revelation. Rather than forced labor, the Americans established a voluntary system that paid prisoners according to the prevailing civilian wage for comparable work, 80 cents per day for most positions. This adherence to the Geneva Convention was itself surprising to many Italians who had expected harsher treatment. More shocking was the discovery that their labor was not particularly essential to the American war effort. Lieutenant Mario Passeri, who worked as a clerk in the camp administrator's office due to his excellent English, gained access to reports showing that prisoner labor contributed less than 2% of the agricultural workforce in most areas. The Americans weren't depending on captured enemies to maintain production. They were offering work largely as a means of alleviating boredom and maintaining order within the camps. Throughout the Southwest, Italian prisoners found themselves working alongside American civilians who demonstrated none of the animosity or desperation they had expected from a nation at war. "The farmers treated us like guest workers, not enemies," wrote Sergeant Enzo Fiore in a journal discovered after his repatriation. "They complained about gasoline rationing and the absence of young men, but their fields were full, their equipment was modern, and they spoke of the war as one might discuss a business challenge rather than a struggle for survival. They worried about sons in Europe, but never about hunger or defeat." By the autumn of 1943, as Italy surrendered to Allied forces and subsequently declared war on Germany, the status of Italian prisoners in America changed dramatically. Reclassified as Italian service units, cooperative prisoners received additional privileges and increasingly worked in settings beyond the camps. This transition accelerated the exposure to American life and further undermined any remaining belief in Axis propaganda. Paolo Rivelli, having demonstrated both reliability and English language skills, began working at a warehouse facility near Phoenix, where he encountered American production systems firsthand. What Paolo witnessed in that warehouse defied comprehension. By Italian standards, crates of canned goods stacked to the ceiling, pallets of new uniforms, equipment, and materials waiting for shipment. Most disturbingly for his fading ideological convictions, he saw how much was discarded, damaged packages routinely thrown away rather than salvaged, excess materials treated as waste rather than precious resources. One incident in particular remained vivid in his later accounts. In November 1943, Paolo observed American workers discarding 47 crates of canned beef that had been rejected for failing to meet quality standards. The quantity would have fed his entire company in North Africa for a month, yet it was deemed unsuitable for American consumption and relegated to waste. I asked the foreman why they would throw away so much food, Paolo recounted in a letter to his brother after repatriation. He looked at me strangely and said, "Because it doesn't meet spec." Not because it was spoiled or dangerous, simply because it didn't meet some standard of quality that existed only in a nation of unimaginable plenty. I thought of our final weeks in Libya when we boiled bootlaces for soup, and I felt a kind of anger I cannot describe, not at the Americans, but at those who had sent us to fight them without understanding what we faced. The warehouse experience was replicated across hundreds of camps and work sites, as Italian prisoners encountered American abundance in various forms. At Camp Hereford in Texas, prisoners worked in agricultural settings where they observed American farming techniques that produced yields 3 to 4 times greater than comparable Italian operations. At Fort Meade in Maryland, Italian prisoners with mechanical skills assisted in vehicle maintenance facilities where they saw the standardization of parts and processes that allowed for rapid repair and return of vehicles that would have been abandoned by resource-strapped Axis forces. In Camp Shelby, Mississippi, prisoners worked in laundry facilities that processed more linens in a day than many had seen in their entire military service in Africa. The statistical contrasts were equally staggering. In 1943, while Italian civilians were limited to 1,000 calories per day under rationing programs, American POW camps provided diets averaging 3,500 calories daily for prisoners engaged in physical labor. While rubber shortages had reduced Italian military vehicles to operating on improvised alternatives, American POW camps in rural areas maintained fleets of trucks for transporting prisoners to work sites and delivering supplies. The typical American POW camp consumed more electricity than many small Italian towns, used more concrete in its construction than had been allocated for civilian building in entire Italian provinces, and received more mail and packages than villages 10 times their population. For Private Giuseppe Verdi, a 19-year-old from Sicily captured in the final days of the North African campaign, The contrast was illustrated through medicine. Having suffered from chronic tooth infections throughout his military service, due to limited dental care, Giuseppe found himself receiving treatment from an American camp dentist within 2 weeks of his arrival at Camp Gordon Johnston in Florida. The dental office had equipment I had never seen, he later told military historians. The dentist gave me more medical attention in 1 hour than I had received in 2 years of service. He expressed shock at the condition of my teeth and performed procedures using anesthetics that were unavailable even to officers in my unit. When I asked why they would waste such care on an enemy, the dentist appeared confused by the question. "These are standard procedures," he said, as if no alternative existed. The medical care extended beyond dentistry. Camp hospitals treated conditions that had been ignored or inadequately addressed by resource-strapped Axis medical units. Men who had lived with hernias, respiratory conditions, and orthopedic injuries found themselves receiving surgeries and treatments that would have been reserved for the highest-ranking officers in their own forces. The systematic approach to health care, with preventive measures, regular examinations, and prompt intervention for identified issues, contrasted sharply with the triage mentality that had dominated their experience. Captain Antonio Russo, a physician who had served in the Italian Medical Corps before his capture, found himself working alongside American doctors at the Camp Clarinda Hospital in Iowa. The experience transformed his understanding of modern medicine. "They had penicillin in quantities that seemed impossible," he recorded in a medical journal he maintained throughout his captivity. "Medications that we rationed like precious metals were administered according to need rather than rank or priority. The operating theater had equipment I had only read about in medical journals, and their diagnostic laboratory could perform tests in hours that would have taken us weeks if we could perform them at all. Most remarkably, they maintained these standards not just for their personnel, but for enemy prisoners. I began to understand that we had not simply been defeated by superior strategy or numbers, but by an entirely different conception of what was possible." By the spring of 1944, as Allied forces made their way up the Italian peninsula and American troops prepared for the invasion of France, the Italian prisoners in America had largely accepted a truth that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. They had been on the wrong side of history, fighting for leaders who had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare and the productive capacity of their enemies. This realization came not through propaganda or re-education efforts, but through the daily experience of American abundance. The ice cream in the desert was not an anomaly, but a symbol of a system that could deliver seemingly impossible results as a matter of routine operation. For Paolo Rivelli, the cognitive adjustment required months of accumulated evidence. Each new observation, from the quantity of food to the quality of medical care to the efficiency of transportation networks, added to a growing certainty that Axis propaganda had catastrophically underestimated American capabilities. The breaking point came on a hot day in August 1944, when Paolo was part of a prisoner work detail harvesting tomatoes on a farm near Camp Florence. During their lunch break, the American supervisor received a delivery from the camp. Fresh ice cream, packed in dry ice, transported 30 miles in summer heat to a remote field where enemy prisoners were being served a frozen dessert that many Italian civilians hadn't tasted since before the war. As Paolo ate his ice cream in the shade of a transport truck, he noticed the farm owner's son, a boy of perhaps 10 years, riding a new bicycle along the edge of the field. The bicycle gleamed in the sun, its rubber tires and metal frame representing materials that had become precious commodities in wartime Italy. When Paolo commented on the bicycle through a fellow prisoner who spoke better English, the farmer replied offhandedly, "Got it last Christmas. Couldn't get the one he really wanted. Though those are still hard to find with the war and all." The casual disappointment in the farmer's voice, the notion that wartime restrictions meant Getting a slightly less desirable model of a luxury item crystallized something for Paolo. That night, he wrote in a journal he had purchased from the camp canteen, "Today I understood completely that we have lost, not simply this war, but the contest of systems. A nation that can deliver ice cream to farm fields and new bicycles to children while fighting across 2 oceans cannot be defeated by one that struggles to supply its frontline troops with boots. The Americans are not simply winning, they exist in a different reality, one where scarcity as we understand it is unknown. They restrict consumption of certain items, but their restrictions would be abundance by our standards. I am a prisoner who eats better than my family in Naples, who receives better medical care than generals in Rome, who has seen more abundance in defeat than I ever witnessed in freedom." Paolo's realization was repeated across hundreds of POW camps as Italian prisoners confronted similar evidence. For many, the transformation was documented in letters home, which, though censored for military information, often contained observations about American life that Italian authorities found more threatening than any tactical details. Sergeant Luca Bianchi, held at Camp Patrick Henry in Virginia, wrote to his father in Milan, "The Americans waste more food in a day than our company consumed in a week in Africa. Their soldiers complain about the quality of rations that would be luxuries at home. Even their dogs eat meat daily." Such letters rarely reached their destinations during the war, but those that did contributed to a growing awareness in Italy that fascist propaganda had misrepresented fundamental realities about American production capacity. The psychological impact of this revelation varied among prisoners. Some, particularly those with strong ideological commitments to fascism, responded with denial and anger, insisting that what they witnessed was an elaborate deception designed to demoralize them. Captain Romano Esposito, a dedicated fascist, held at Camp Gruber in Oklahoma, maintained throughout his captivity that the abundance he observed was a Hollywood production, a false front hiding American weakness. Yet, even the most committed ideologues found their convictions tested by the consistency and scale of the evidence surrounding them. For most Italian prisoners, however, the response was a pragmatic acceptance that transformed their post-war ambitions. Surveys conducted by American intelligence officers in early 1945 found that over 70% of Italian prisoners expressed a desire to emigrate to the United States after repatriation. This represented a remarkable shift in perspective for men who had been actively fighting American forces less than 2 years earlier. The primary reason cited was not political freedom or democratic values, though these were mentioned, but economic opportunity and material abundance. As one anonymous prisoner wrote in a survey response, "I have seen enough to know that a common laborer in America lives better than a professional in Italy. The difference is not small, but vast, and I cannot unsee what I have witnessed," though we educational impact extended beyond material comparisons. Many camps established libraries and offered courses ranging from basic English to technical skills, and even college-level instruction. Italian prisoners with specialized knowledge often served as instructors, while American educators from nearby communities taught English and American history. This educational program, implemented primarily to prevent boredom and maintain order, had the unintended consequence of exposing prisoners to American educational methods, technical knowledge, and cultural values. Lieutenant Giovanni Rossi, who had been a civil engineer before the war, found himself teaching mathematics to fellow prisoners while taking English and American history classes at Camp Atterbury in Indiana. The Americans approach education differently, he observed in notes prepared for a post-war report. It is practical, focused on application rather than theory. Their engineering textbooks emphasize solutions rather than problems, and their methods prioritize efficiency over elegance. Most surprisingly, they make no distinction between the education offered to officers and enlisted men. A common soldier with aptitude receives the same instruction as a captain. This democratic approach to knowledge distribution may explain how they achieve such uniformly high production standards. By the time Italy's new government declared war on Germany in October 1943, becoming a co-belligerent with the Allies, many Italian prisoners had already undergone this transformation in perspective. The official reclassification of Italian prisoners as members of Italian service units with expanded privileges and responsibilities merely formalized a shift that had been occurring naturally through exposure to American systems. These units took on increasingly significant roles in the American war economy, working in hospitals, factories, farms, and maintenance facilities, further integrating into the system that had so thoroughly challenged their previous understanding of economic possibility. The contrast between Italian expectations and American reality was perhaps most poignantly illustrated through the packages many prisoners sent home after Italy's changed status allowed such shipments. Sergeant Enzo Fiore, working at Camp Swift in Texas, saved his 80-cent daily pay for weeks to purchase items for his family in Bologna: coffee, sugar, chocolate, soap, and cigarettes, luxury items in war-torn Italy, standard commissary goods in American POW camps. When he finally received a reply months later, his mother's letter revealed the tragic irony of his situation. "My son, these few cigarettes and this small bag of sugar are more than I have seen in a year." The chocolate brought tears to your father's eyes as he had forgotten the taste. "How strange that you, a prisoner of our enemy, can send us treasures we cannot find in our own land. How strange that you eat better in captivity than we do in freedom." This inversion, prisoners living in greater comfort than their free families, became a common theme in correspondence. As the war in Italy intensified, with Germany occupying the northern regions and Allied forces fighting their way up from the south, civilians faced hardships far worse than those experienced by their captured soldiers in America. Reports of food shortages, fuel scarcity, and collapse of basic services reached the camps through censored news and occasional letters, creating a surreal disconnect between the prisoners' daily reality and conditions at home. By early 1945, as Allied victory appeared increasingly certain, American authorities began preparing Italian service unit members for eventual repatriation. This process included vocational training programs designed to provide skills useful in post-war reconstruction. These programs, teaching everything from modern agricultural techniques to mechanical repairs to construction methods, were ostensibly implemented to assist Italy's recovery, but they also served as further demonstrations of American technical approaches and standards. For Paolo Ravelli, who participated in a construction training program at Camp Florence, the experience provided yet another contrast with Italian methods. "They taught us to build using standards that would be considered wasteful in Italy," he noted in his journal. "The amount of concrete per foundation, the thickness of walls, the quantity of insulation, all exceeded anything I had seen in civilian construction at home. When I asked the instructor why they used so much material, he showed me calculations demonstrating how these excesses reduced long-term costs through energy efficiency and reduced maintenance. It was a different way of thinking about resources, not as finite materials to be conserved, but as investments to be optimized." As the European War reached its conclusion in May 1945, the process of repatriating Italian prisoners began in earnest. Over the next 18 months, tens of thousands of former prisoners returned to an Italy devastated by war, bringing with them not just memories, but transformed perspectives and technical knowledge. The contrast between the country they had left and the one they had experienced as prisoners created a generation of informal ambassadors for American methods and standards. The impact of this mass exposure to American abundance would be felt in Italian politics, economics, and culture for decades. Many former prisoners became advocates for American-style production methods, forming part of the entrepreneurial class that would drive Italy's post-war economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s. Others used their experience to advocate for political and economic reforms aligned with American models. Some, making good on intentions formed during captivity, eventually emigrated to the United States, becoming part of the post-war Italian-American community. The statistical evidence of this influence appears in various forms. A study conducted by the University of Rome in 1962 found that businesses founded or managed by former POWs who had been held in America were 27% more likely to adopt American production methods and showed an average productivity 34% higher than comparable firms without such leadership. Regions with high concentrations of returned prisoners showed accelerated rates of technological adoption, particularly in agriculture and light manufacturing, precisely the sectors where prisoners had gained the most exposure to American methods. Perhaps most telling were the cultural changes. Returned prisoners brought with them not just technical knowledge, but transformed expectations about consumption, quality, and possibility. They had experienced a system where abundance was the norm rather than the exception, where standardization created consistency rather than limitation, and where waste was preferable to scarcity if it maintained quality standards. These concepts, alien to the European experience of perpetual scarcity and careful conservation, gradually infiltrated Italian economic thinking through the lived experience of these former prisoners. For Paolo Rivelli, the journey came full circle in 1953, when he opened a gelateria in Naples using techniques and recipes he had studied while working in the Camp Florence mess hall. The shop, named Arizona in reference to his place of captivity, became known for its American-style ice cream, richer, creamier, and served in larger portions than traditional Italian gelato. When interviewed by a local newspaper on the 10th anniversary of his business, Paolo reflected on the irony of his journey. "I went to war against America, never having tasted ice cream, then experienced it for the first time as their prisoner in the desert. Now I serve it to Neapolitans who line up for this small luxury that once represented to me the impossible wealth of our former enemy." History takes strange paths. The story of Italian prisoners encountering American ice cream in desert POW camps is more than an anecdote about wartime curiosities. It represents a profound moment of cultural and economic revelation that helped reshape post-war Europe. The simple act of serving frozen desserts to enemy prisoners in arid environments, thousands of miles from production centers, demonstrated a logistical capacity and abundance that propaganda could not explain away. For men like Paolo Rivelli, that first taste of ice cream in the Arizona heat became a watershed moment, the point at which the gap between expectation and reality became too vast to bridge with ideology. What these prisoners witnessed was not merely military defeat, but the bankruptcy of an entire economic worldview. The fascist economic model, with its emphasis on autarky, centralized control, and nationalist mobilization, had proved catastrophically inadequate when measured against American productive capacity. The ice cream served in desert camps became a visceral symbol of this disparity, a luxury transformed into a routine provision through systems of production and distribution that the Axis powers could neither match nor comprehend. As Paolo Rivelli and thousands of other Italian prisoners returned to their devastated homeland after the war, they carried with them more than memories of abundance. They brought a transformed understanding of what was possible, the knowledge that scarcity was not inevitable, that systems could be designed for surplus rather than shortage, and that efficiency could create abundance rather than merely managing scarcity. These insights helped fuel Italy's remarkable post-war recovery and integration into the Western economic model. The ice cream served in those desert camps represented more than a momentary pleasure or propaganda victory. It was tangible evidence of a different way of organizing economic life. In the decades that followed, as Italy rebuilt and eventually joined the ranks of prosperous industrialized nations, the lessons learned by former prisoners in American camps found expression in factories, farms, and businesses across the peninsula. The transformation that began with disbelief, ice cream in the desert, concluded with emulation, as Italian society increasingly adopted the methods and standards that had once seemed impossibly wasteful from the perspective of wartime scarcity. In this way, a simple dessert served to enemy prisoners became an instrument of profound economic and cultural change, demonstrating how material abundance could achieve what military might alone could not. The lasting transformation of an adversary into an ally through the irrefutable evidence of a better way of life. For Paolo Rovelli and countless others like him, American ice cream in the Arizona desert wasn't just an unexpected luxury. It was the first taste of a future they would help build in their homeland, one bowl at a time.